Hey guys, we're back here on the roundtable. Zach's off today. If this is your first time on the roundtable, we bring in guests like Don Sizer from Third Element Consulting and others, and we talk about cyber frameworks, cybersecurity, and of course, all things running an MSP. Um, if you haven't seen us before, you may also not know. You can find us on YouTube and LinkedIn. Our video libraries on YouTube for many episodes, like how to get cyber insurance, how to do government contracts, stuff like that. Don, you were just relating this semi-related story that our listeners may be surprised to learn you're in your own disaster recovery planning. Like you're deep in it today,
I'm
right?
deep in it today. Exactly. So we all have to live somewhere, and of course we picked this amazing little mountainside community that's completely wooded. We're not even allowed to cut down trees, that kind of thing. It's really wooded, and of course we have no generator because it was built in the 1970s, that kind of thing. So today is generator day, and in fact they're upgrading our panel and all kinds of fun stuff like that. So I am at the office because I can't work from home today because I have no electricity. It's also being very cold when I get home because it's like 20 degrees out. So, and snowing still, I think. Yes, snowing still.
So maybe you don't want to dox yourself on air, but I heard you got
No, yeah.
the fancy one with the digital transfer panel and stuff. But here's my question: is there an app? Is that like a thing now?
I don't know. I literally don't know. So it
Oh,
was
this is
it
going
was
to be
one of
an
those.
adventure.
It's gonna be an adventure. So my husband and I had talked about this and he's like, "You know what? I'm just gonna take care of it." We have a really good relationship with one of the electrical folks in the area. And he's like, "You know what?" He's suggested that we get all of this stuff. I'm like, "Yeah, that's fine. What's the cost?" He told me what the cost was, and I'm like, "Wow, I thought it was gonna be double that." So yay. Because that's always a good thing. So it came in like literally when we said, "Okay, go ahead and pull the trigger to do the install and stuff." The generator showed up like I think 2 days later on a truck, just like randomly, like like okay, it's here. Here we
So
are.
they had to pour a pad, I presume,
So they're not
and
pouring the pad today. They're upgrading the panel today. So all the electrical
okay.
is getting done today, and then next week, as soon as it stops snowing, they're going to pour the pad for it, and then connect
Well, that
everything
was going to
together.
be my
And
next question because we both apparently live in snowland. It has been
do.
frigid the last 2 days here. It was so cold. I got one of my high schoolers to wear pants for the first time this year
Oh, nice. Yeah.
because he thinks shorts are like an all year affair. Um, but it was cold enough. I convinced him. When it's 8 degrees in the morning Fahrenheit, like that's apparently pants weather.
Oh, the good news
Um,
is once they hit college, they actually put pants back on again. So
We'll
there's that.
see. We will see. But how are they going to pour the pad in the winter?
In the winter, so as I hear it, they actually use, heated tubing and heated blanket to keep it warm enough so that they just lay it down on top of the concrete and they keep it warm and that's it.
All right.
So
Well, that was a perfect little intro story to today's theme. Um, Before we jump into like the larger conversation and anecdotes about um, planning gone well and gone wrong, I want to take the opportunity to jump into a NIST CSF control area. Today is going to be recover, and here we go. So NIST CSF 2 is in draft right now. Perhaps by the time you are watching this, it has been finalized. I don't expect any major changes. There was only a few areas to NIST CSF's recover category in version 1. And in fact, they removed one of those. They removed it, the improvements category, to a different part of security planning, which leaves us with recovery planning and execution and recovery communication. So, there's subcategories in each of these. Real quick, I'm just going to run down it. And Dawn, stop me or chime in if these descriptions can be like a little jargony, right?
yeah, absolutely.
So we've got recovery RP for recovery plan 01. So This is to make sure that there's an incident response plan that is available and can be executed from the beginning of an incident. Right when it covers everything before, during, and after the incident, and it makes sure everyone knows what they should be doing throughout. Right, so the whole life cycle plan should be in place. Plan O2. The actions should all be determined, scoped, prioritized, and then of course, um, there should be some way to make sure that they're actually performed in an incident, right? And that people aren't skipping things. O3 of the plan, specifically that there should be integrity on backups and other assets, and that they should be verified before they're used in restoration. Back in the tape era, we had to worry about this a lot. There was always bad tapes in a set, and so it was frequently the issue that if you weren't testing and verifying your backups, you'd go to do a restore, and maybe you'd be 3 days in running the restore and not realize that your backups were bad, right? But if it's not tapes, there's still other processes you need to do to verify your restoration assets. O4, and we're going to talk more about this later. You need to map your critical mission functions. Make sure that cyber risk management's considered during your incident, and making sure that after the incident you're getting back to operational norms. O5, making sure the integrity of the restored assets is verified after restoration. So that's both before you restore and after you restore. You make sure that the system is operating the way it should, right? And O6, um, you need a criteria for determining when an incident is over. At some point you need to say, line in the sand, the incident's over. Perhaps there's some after action that needs to happen at that time. It might be reporting, it might be communicating to stakeholders. So that's the planning piece and the pieces that are supposed to be in a plan. Before I jump into the communication aspect, Don, this is like technical jargony stuff, but what have you seen for plans that work really well? Are these like long things, or like what have you seen that's worked best?
So it depends on the business, right? There's plenty of templates that are out there. NIST has a great one that's super long. I think it's like 76 or 79 pages, which is great. I mean, it touches everything that you'd want to think about. But if you don't have something that needs something that's that comprehensive, talk to your insurance company. Chances are they're going to have something that's short, sweet, to the point, and it might even be as little as one page that you can, take, make for yourself and just hit the spots that you really need to worry about for your business or your client's business, depending on, how many different things they have to worry about. You
Yeah.
touched on, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, the there was this tendency a few years ago to make these plans as comprehensive as possible to make everyone happy when they asked for plans, right? But then you'd end up with a long document no one would ever read and no one would ever follow, and no one would notice that it's not even followable, right? So I appreciate you saying it could be a page, and you're absolutely right.
Well, what we have found is that yes, you can take a look at things and yes, you can write plans for absolutely everything. But the reality is just when you think you have a plan for everything, something else stupid happens that you didn't plan for, and then you can literally wad up your plan, throw it out the window, and then start from scratch. So having something that is critically important, but yet generic enough so that you can keep following the plan no matter what has happened is the important part. And the only way to figure that out is to run through the plan a couple times to see, what you actually need, what you don't need, what you need to plan for, and what you don't. So it's those tabletop exercises of really talking through, well, what if this type of thing happens? Well, what if we lose, power? What if we lose this? What if we lose that? Um, and as you're talking through that, you'll kind of figure out the information that you need to have documented and what you may
Yeah, I mean
only need in a scenario.
you're absolutely right. The goal here isn't to like get to a plan like which is a PDF file and say I'm done with it, right? There's an actual process to create it and to make sure that it's understood and to make sure it's followed and to make sure that it's appropriate and that people know how to use it and that it's going to work, right? And all those things take a long time, right? And you need to do them
Exactly.
over and over. Um, So, yeah, I
But
mean,
the
the NIST CSF doesn't get into that reality, right? But that's a reality of any planning process, right?
It is, and I think part of that too is once you get to that point of sitting down and figuring it out, right? That was mission critical functions. That was one of the other things that you had mentioned, right? What truly is mission critical for you may not be mission critical for a client. So figuring out where those tipping points are or where the convergences are for the mission critical things, that will determine what your plan looks like too.
So, before we get into more details on the planning side, I want to cover more of what NIST CSF does say, which is that while they've tried to make the planning process really simple and incident recovery really simple, they have retained most of the communication um, function. And there's regulatory reasons for this, but there's also just good sense reasons for this. So in recovery communication, which is rc.co, we've got O3, which is that the activities and progress in throughout an incident, restoring, um, discovery, whatever is happening in the incident life cycle, it needs to be communicated to both internal and external stakeholders. So internal stakeholders, which are the people using the systems inside your organization, but also the people that are operating the incident life cycle inside your organization, right? But also external stakeholders. So this is your clients, just to inform your customers and retain credibility, but also increasingly, and some of our viewers may not be aware of this. Uh, there are state laws all over the United States and all over the world that regulate these uh, these activities, the communication of an incident outside your organization, and we've got some. The legislators have some room or some places they still need to go there. In fact, we've got laws that directly conflict with each other. But here in the U.S., if you're going to be compliant with all 50 states, you need to be communicating your incidents within 24 hours, and you need to maintain communication regularly until you've closed out the incident. Um, so it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but that's the reality of today.
It is, and
Uh,
then getting
yeah,
into what that looks like, right, is the hard part. How do you decide what type of language to use and what you're going to communicate and where you're getting that language from? Because having your technical people maybe write that is not the way you want to communicate that to your external stakeholders, and getting your information from marketing is probably not the best idea either. So talking to your legal, your lawyer or whoever you're using for legal for inside of this, or your insurance company, they may already have canned language for you that you can use. So you might want to write that into part of your plan too, which is nice. So you know what to tell people when they're asking for things. You might actually, if you have an incident in some way, shape, or form where you have to start communicating to the outside world, hire a PR company that can take what legal and your insurance company is giving you, fluff it slightly so it sounds a little bit better, and put it out to the stakeholders that
yeah,
are external.
and it's worth noting that there are some combination PR breach response organizations out there, and in some cases, it is appropriate to seek out that
Yep.
specialty support.
Depending on how large you are and or what type of clients you have, because that might make a difference to the client.
Yep. Um, so we just talked about that need for internal, external stakeholder communication, but the other thing NIST CSF says is these updates, um, they need to be shared through approved messages and messaging. And Don just covered the messaging part, like making sure that the messages going out, either there's an approvals process to massage what goes out, right? To make sure it's not too much information, too little information, the wrong information, right? um, but also that those channels are established in advance. They're approved in advance, right? Um, a lot of companies have status pages, right? Like SaaS companies particularly have status pages, right? Or they say we will post on, I guess it's X now, right? If we have a problem. But you want to tell your customers like, look, this is where official messages are coming from, right? You don't want them getting their information from what could be an unapproved channel, which may not even be someone from your organization, right? Um, so That's NIST CSF. They don't have a lot to say on this because they're really strong on sort of the spirit of what you should be doing in your recovery, right? The implementation specifics are actually dictated by other more specific technical frameworks. So NIST CSF will be used in reference with a NIST 853 or an ISO 27K or a CIS. You would use the restoration procedures that are a little bit more technical and specific along with these um, NIST CSF guidances. So that's it for the NIST CSF conversation. Um, in the real world, we don't always necessarily care what control ID is associated with our planning process, and you know um, the arbitrary lines in the sand between like .03 and .04. But I loved your advice about seeking out support on that messaging. I think th- they will help you with the plans as well.
They
Um,
will, but there's always an optic, right, for everything that goes out from your company, and you wanted to make sure that you're giving the best one that you possibly can. And the only way to do that sometimes is not do it yourself, because sometimes you get down so far into the weeds that you're not sure what the best language to use is, and you may be shooting yourself in the foot, for lack of a better term. So letting somebody else handle some of that messaging and what it should say and what the optic is going out is the best way to do that.
yeah, and I also know that despite it sounds like 24 hours is a lot of pressure, right? There's a fire burning under you to move and make a response, and that's a real thing. But there's always time to sit back and think and ask someone else for advice and spend 20 minutes doing that, spend an hour doing that, spend 2 hours doing that, get it right. um, One of the things that happens during an incident, and this is like a state of mind thing that the security standards don't talk about at all, is when there's a fire burning, people's adrenaline kick in, right? Their fight or flight response kicks in, right? And in that moment, the reason you want to have a plan is so that you can pack 10 months of planning and thinking, right, into a document that does not require you to think when you're in that state. When you are in that state, if you're having to be too creative, right, and you're right, Don, like the plan's going to be outdated as soon as the real thing happens, right? But if you're having to become too creative in that moment, um, human error can be your worst enemy, right? A small incident can turn into a really, really big incident if you're rushed and you're doing things you wouldn't normally do, right? Maybe you have normal operating procedures to keep things safe, but they're like, oh, it's a disaster, and you start punching things and you break something. And I once downed an Oracle server that way. Um, and
We've all had that one, right? So, and in the same manner, right? We all have incident response can be super simple, right? It's down to the point of, oh, we've lost a drive in something. That's still an incident response. We have to go fix that in some way, shape, or form. And we had a client that had a really good incident response plan, and they had things in place for loss of electricity and loss of this and loss of that. And they had a toilet overflow that was above their server room. They did not have a plan for that. So it was super simple thing that can happen to anybody that they just didn't have a plan for, because what's the possibility of a toilet overflowing that would possibly adjust how you'd have to deal with your server cabinet or your server room or something like that. That wasn't in their list of things to deal with. So that's why I'm saying, like, make your plans generic enough that you can follow them no matter what happens, and not be so specific that you can't see the forest for the trees.
so that sounds easy and it sounds right. But I know for a fact it's not easy
It's not.
because finding that like place in the middle there is actually really hard. So I think that when you are planning for recovery, when you are planning for contingencies, like things that can come up, they're not always declared incidents, right?
No,
But
they're not. And I think it comes back to that, what's actually critical, right? So
right, what's
what can we live
critical?
without? What has to come back first? What does that look like? And no matter, every time you talk to any company, it doesn't matter what it is, it's like, well, what has to come back first? And they're like, well, all of it. Okay, but realistically, that's not true. Like,
So
Do you need payroll day one? Maybe not. Maybe you don't need it except for these particular days, right? And those are the only days that that would be something that's mission critical.
Yeah, when I was in my first corporate gig, um, we had our critical systems, which is our Unix system that ran like a an application that you'd log into over a terminal.
Right.
And we
We're
considered
just not
that to
going to
be
talk about how long ago that was.
we considered that to be pretty critical, right? And of course, it was a manufacturer, right?
Right.
So there was manufacturing space and there was office space, and the office space was populated by office people who thought that their jobs were more important than the manufacturing jobs. But the most critical asset in the whole facility that I knew of was actually the thermal label printer out on the receiving docks.
Yeah, because that's what got everything out the door, right?
Yes, because that's what got everything out the door. But it was like in a trucker lounge, right? And it
Yeah.
wasn't taken care of, and it was all dusty, and people didn't act like it was critical, right? And maybe no one really knew it was critical until it was broken, and then everyone knew it was critical. Um, but I think that's the kind of thing you need to figure out like way in advance, right? Um,
Exactly.
so, I mean, how do you even find things like that? I mean, I've done tabletop exercises, and but even that, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. What have you found? How do you do that discovery process?
Oh my gosh, the easiest way to do it, right, is look over the last year's worth of tickets for any organization and you figure out the things that people cry about the most. Those
That's
are
great.
usually
That's great.
like it's silly, but like there's always one printer, right, that everybody uses, or it's the one that's used for a mission critical thing or something along those lines. But it's the same type of anytime you have a bunch of people that put a ticket in about a thing that suddenly isn't working, that's a mission critical item, application, whatever it is. So I think you can, first of all, look at your tickets and figure out from there, especially if you're doing this for a client. Internally, it's a little harder because we usually yell at each other to do something. But if you're doing it for a client, look at your ticket counts on specific things. And if you're seeing a pattern of people complaining about one particular thing, that might be a mission critical item.
So that makes a lot of sense. Presuming it's a thing that is there are things that are incredibly reliable, right? And you don't
Mhm.
realize that
And you don't think
they're
about them.
you
Yep.
don't think about them. They like disappear from reality, right?
Mhm.
Until they're broken.
Right.
Security is one of those things, right?
Security is one of those things, and, I feel like I should knock on wood, and I have some to knock on here. 365 outages haven't been a thing for a little while, and we forget about that too until we have an outage, and then people, like, lose their minds over something that we can't control, they can't control, nobody can control except for Microsoft, and sometimes that's even out of their control. So I think you have to make a list of those things too, and make sure that you're identifying them, but understand too that there are things that are not in the control of you, of the client, anywhere in the actual supply chain. There's not a lot of control over.
So make the critical things list. That can inform both your security processes, is
I'm
like to
sorry,
stop the
Reagan.
incident, right? As well
Right.
as the recovery processes. They're both required. Like ideally, you don't have any incident, right? But they will happen, right? So we do need to recover from them when they happen. Um, what
Exactly.
what do you think is like what is the category of contingency that we should be thinking about that's not like maybe not a security emergency, maybe someone wouldn't normally use the incident label. Some people might use the incident label, right? But what are those things that are like contingencies we need to plan for? I know like you brought up Office 365 a few minutes ago, right?
Right.
What if one of those contingencies is like for whatever reason you need to like dump a vendor, right? Um like is that the type of thing that you think people should be planning for?
100%. I mean, you should, especially your key vendors, right? Anybody in your supply chain that's a massive vendor in your particular ecosystem. If you had to cut them today, what would happen? Do you have an option? Do you have a secondary? Do you have a tertiary? What does that look like for you? We do a lot of contingency plans for local government, and we talk to them about like oxygen distributors, right? So they have EMS crews. Maybe they have to have a at least a third or fourth chain in there. Like if they suddenly can't get oxygen from somebody, who do they go to next? What about next? What about next? So I think there are things like that that are truly mission critical to your organization in some way, shape, or form. And again, they're going to be things that you're not thinking of necessarily until all of a sudden they're not there, right? So how do you go about doing that? Like maybe you have an application even that's kind of a one-off, or they've written something very specific to you. What happens if they suddenly go under?
I think I think the whole world got really good at this imagination process through COVID,
Yeah, they
right?
did.
It
They
wasn't
did.
just like the pandemic that came to eat us, right? It was also like the fact that people all of a sudden weren't
And
going
then there
into
was
the
no toilet
office.
paper. Now what do we do?
There was so many of those moments, right? I think people are good at that, but I'm not sure that they're any better at the planning part. Because I
Right.
haven't seen, I've seen a little bit more commitment to security spending, right, and governance, but I haven't seen a lot of commitment to the ongoing contingency planning. And there's organizations that have always been doing it, right, and they refresh their plans, but they're getting dated again already. It's what I've seen. So
Well, I mean, it's like everything else. You write a plan and then you either put it in a piece of software and you forget about it, or you put it in a manual and you put it up on your shelf, and that's where it gets dusty. And you don't take it out again until you need something. And by then it's too late. So there's never enough time in the day for things, but it's like everything else. You have to get it scheduled. You have to do it. Just make it part of, maybe it's a quarterly, maybe it's semi-annually. It has to be at some point though. It has to happen. It has to be reviewed, and people just aren't doing it.
I love the idea of declaring incidents for things that aren't that bad. I love working out those muscles. You know, I think that if people sometimes look for excuses to do like tabletop exercises or recovery planning once a year, but I like the excuse to do it like every couple of weeks, right? Like something's going to come up in your business, right? And it's probably going to be really easy incident, open and shut, right? And I think that all of us as service providers could probably take a class of what we consider to be normal tickets, right? And say, well, no, this is an incident, right? And work out that playbook. Um, we had a comment here asking about how do we can we discuss good ways to come up with tabletop scenarios. I'm going to bring up one. I don't think this isn't going to solve all the things, right? But I've been playing with backdoors and breaches. Do you guys know about that? So
Is it like shoots and ladders? Because
it's
that's kind of
it's a
fun.
card game from Black Hills InfoSec, and it's like all the ways someone can get into your system, move laterally, escalate privilege, like, and then get at your assets, and then you as the attacker, sorry, it's sort of like Clue. So those cards are predetermined as the attacker, right? And
Oh,
then
neat.
the defenders, right, have to tabletop through their policies and procedures and safeguards to discover the attack and stop it before we run out. And I think that it's a really neat game for working out infosec procedures. Mid enterprise or larger. For small business, maybe not appropriate. I would love to see a small business version of that deck, but I think that you things like that can help. Um, I also love the real time Delphi um, method, or the Delphi method, which is where, and you need a moderator for this one, right? You get a bunch of stakeholders in a room, and ideally it's stakeholders from all over the organization, um, and you stick them at a table, and you ask them to just like write all their nightmares down on pieces of paper, right? And then the moderator consolidates them. It's important that when we're collecting nightmares, though, we don't add names to them, right? They're supposed to be anonymous, and the moderator's job is to put them into a pile. The last thing you want is the CEO's nightmares to be the only ones that are cared for, right? But that's a great way of collecting the nightmares. So in terms of
I've never heard
collecting,
it. I've never heard it discussed that way, but that's how we do them. So When that question came up, I was like, you know what, we just did one the other day, which was the loss of equipment. So what happens if somebody misplaces a laptop or a phone or something like that? That's one of my personal nightmares. Like, what happens if our information gets out into the
It's not
world,
like
right?
what happens if that like happens like all the time.
Right?
That's going to happen, right?
But that's
Yeah.
actually a really good one. I like the nightmares scenario
Yeah.
thing because it is a good way to figure out what's important to other people and have that playbook of what to do when.
Yeah, and I think the reason it's really important to collect the stakeholders from all over the org is you may end up with a someone in charge of like the facility, right? Literally talking about stuffed toilets because
Mhm.
they know that that happens sometimes, and when that happens, it overflows, and not all the bathrooms have drains, and the water flows across the floor, and then it comes down into the server room, and that's what their like nightmares are about. Like
Right?
you didn't foresee that, Don, because
Who
you weren't
would?
the guy. But there are people that would foresee that, right? Because those are the
That's
things
right.
that they deal with, right?
That's right. And I mean, the facilities folks, like if you they deal with so much stuff that it's amazing. We had another client that had the nice big light poles in their parking lot. Same type of scenario, right? Facilities guy is in charge of these and realized that when it rained really hard, some of the light bulbs would pop. Well, it was on the same circuit as one of the circuits in another server room, and it would pop there
Wow.
too. Like it was just a new building, right? So it was this weird cascade of events that was creating an issue that they couldn't figure out why something was happening until corroborating evidence came in and said, "Oh, hey, we were also replacing light bulbs because the rain from the other night had popped it." And we were like, every time a storm would come through, what's going on?
Yep.
The electric wasn't going out, but
Yep.
generator wasn't kicking in. And then facilities guy stopped by and goes, "Oh, hey, by the way," I'm like, "That's what's going on."
Yeah. And of course, we want the people from the finance team, right? And
Yep.
sometimes they're trained not to think about nightmares because they want to stay in their lane and not
Yeah.
like add more nightmares to their world. But they are afraid of like what happens if someone gets access to that checking account, right? What happens if some data entry is wrong? Like what happens if I like get like a fake whatever in the mail? They are worried about those things, right? They may
Right.
not know
What
the answer of how to solve it, but
exactly. Well, I mean that whole like what happens if we accidentally transfer $30,000 somewhere because we got a phishing email? What does that look like? What's the process that we go through with the bank? Will they cover it? Won't they cover it? What does that look like for us? And then who do we have to notify that that happened, right?
so I think in the security world, this thing we're talking about, this like type conversation, there's specific methodologies to this, but a lot of us do this type of stuff, right? I think that there's a lot of similarities to this part of the process. What to do with the things you find in that conversation, though, I've seen a big diversity. Some people take every single thing that comes up during a threat model or a threat exercise like that, and they're like, okay, we have to solve for every single one of these, right? Um, and that's one way you could go about it. I liked your focus earlier on would the plan survive the enemy, right? Is a great test, right? Not
Right.
like does the plan include every step along the way, but would the plan actually be operable in this scenario, right?
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with not necessarily having a plan for something, but writing a policy instead. Like, "Hey, this is how we deal with this particular thing so that it doesn't have to be this enormous plan that tries to cover absolutely everything. Instead, you have a policy for if if that then this, or if this then that, whatever."
Yeah. So we distribute the SANS policy library to people. It doesn't go very far outside technology, but what I love about their examples is, first of all, they're free, right? Don't pay for those things, guys. The the, uh, the second thing I love about them is they're all super short. They are like the 2-page, 3-page version that like pretty much anyone in the org can read them and understand them, and they understand the policy, right? Um, you brought up was it a NIST example of an incident response plan? I think I've seen
NIST
that
has a
before.
huge one. It is
Yeah,
enormous.
Yeah, yeah. There's CIS has a bunch of samples that you can download that have come from California, New York, and other places. Where else can people find examples of like what these things look like after they've gone through the planning exercise, but then they have to pan it? Like,
I mean, the best thing is to like look for failed ones. I think
oh,
that's
I
like you can
haven't done
literally
that
Google
before.
like failed
What
plans,
was wrong with this plan?
right? Exactly. And people will be like, okay, so we had this plan and here's all the places that it failed and like how to learn from what other people have done. I think that is almost or even maybe more important than trying to build a plan yourself is figuring out how other people's plans have failed and not doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, I've definitely seen over and over again. Well, the plan had a solution, but it was so complicated that no one followed it. Right? It wasn't consistently followed because
Yeah, I
people
mean, you
didn't
literally
understand it.
have to write the instructions so an eighth grader can follow them because it might not be the people that you think are going to be there are the ones dealing with it. Occasionally, it happens that for whatever reason, you have the least common denominator sitting there trying to handle something, and that's what you've got to work with.
Yeah, I remember. I believe it was the Equifax breach. Um, they had a policy of, hey, if a certain type of vulnerability is found in a certain type of system, it needs to be like acted on, whatever. And they were no, they found the vulnerability. Like they had a policy of finding vulnerabilities. They found the vulnerabilities. There was a person assigned to finding it. That person was in charge of like letting other people know about it, but the policy didn't dictate like specifically that the person who received that notification had to drop everything and like dance.
Do
And
something. Yeah. So yeah,
that
that's a good, failed policy learning point. The other thing is if you have a SOC that you're working with, whether it's an MSSP or a SOC provider, a lot of them create playbooks for how to do incident response depending on that particular thing. So picking up some of their playbooks is very helpful too. I think it gives you a really good template for how they're running any type of incident internally for you. And that gives you an idea of how to run something either for a client or for yourself as well.
So that's super informational from both of us. Should we get a little grittier here? What do
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
you're and you have your own practice, right?
For
So
some things, yes.
without naming names, like, but you've been exposed to some real incidents, right? So like,
Yes. Yeah.
what can you walk us through one from like a theoretical, like
Yeah, I
step
have
by
a couple
step?
favorites. So
Great.
we we had one that's I'm gonna call it a non-incident incident. And let me
Okay.
explain why. Because it was a known vendor that the incident happened around, but what had happened was our SOC saw lateral movement happening from server to server out of China, which should never happen. But it was from what they thought was a real vendor.
So wait,
Well,
let me back up.
yep,
Lateral movement from China. So just like they saw an inbound connection coming from
inbound
someplace in
connection.
China,
Hmm.
and then they saw after that connection, it was connected to an asset like a server or workstation or
Correct.
something.
So good credentials coming in
Good credentials coming in from China, but
from
then
China
they
looked like
saw
they were lateral movement from server to server
but from server to server. So it's the attacker or someone is on one thing, and then they're using that access to get something else that
to
they
move
couldn't
to
get from
another server.
China,
So
right?
at this point, they're watching what's going on. They're seeing them doing what looks like real work, and then they shut it down because like it just that was not part of the playbook that should be happening in any way, shape, or form. So it was immediately cut, sandboxed, and then the forensic started. So what had actually happened was the vendor does have a marketing department in China and some other department in China. There's never supposed to be touch coming from China, especially on the dev or technical side, but it did. And suddenly everyone found out that, oh, they actually do have people in China that are doing work that shouldn't have been doing it, especially for a government group.
Yeah, I mean that's actually just backing up a little bit. That's actually a super common scenario. It is
Right?
way more common than people probably realize. I mean, we're in a global world these days, and I think that we may be post offshoring that word. Okay, first we talked about offshoring, and then it was like, and then we had this hybrid thing, offshore and on prem. But the reality is, organizations now are just like spaghetti all over the planet. All of us, right?
Correct.
And but there are scenarios where we actually need to care, right? And
This was one of them.
this was
Yeah,
one of them. And but we all are living in this world, right? So,
right. Had this
I,
been a different type of business, it wouldn't have mattered one way, shape, form, or the other. And
yep.
same thing would have happened because it's probably not something that we would have told them to expect, so they would have shut it down anyway. But like I said, with the forensic response and track back, that vendor had to answer for what was going on to, in this case, it was a police
So
department.
that incident from an operational perspective was open and closed pretty quickly because you were able to shut the connection. And I don't know if the user got suspended or not, but basically things were stalled out pretty quickly. But then what? Like then you have to communicate to, like, what did that
So
look like then?
So SOC calls us. We're on the phone with the SOC. They're explaining what had happened. We get the client on the phone and we say, look, it looks like it was actually this vendor. So either the vendor is compromised or the vendor lied. Pick one, that kind of thing. Um, or at least misrepresented what what was going on there. Let's call it misrepresented. Um, and so then client says, all right, we're going to go find out. They get the vendor on the phone and vendor says, oh, well, that doesn't happen. We don't have those people in China. I'm like, here's the here's the evidence. Like, there it is. So they went back and said, yeah, actually that was exactly what it was. It was a dev from that area that had logged in to do some work. They shouldn't have. They were not supposed to be doing that. And we're sorry.
Yeah, there is a third scenario though, which is it. Yeah, it could be there was a compromise. It could be they lied. It could also be someone in chain just doesn't care, and apathy is actually it's not quite a lie, but it's just as dangerous, maybe more dangerous, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's fair. And I think like with every story, right? There's this side, that side, and what's actually true in the middle. So as we saw it, that's what it looked like. That's what it looked like to the SOC. That's what it looked like to the client. And it was a bad situation all the way around, quite frankly, that could have been very easily not have ever happened. So
So, some after action probably would be some vendor sanctioning at that point. But what about, I mean, in that situation, was that an opportunity to say, you know what, maybe we don't want connections from this IP space at all?
that's
Or did you
exactly what
say,
happened.
okay,
So yeah, that's exactly what happened. So we cut any type of connection coming in from there and relayed that to the vendor. Like, we're just shutting all of that down. The only way it comes in is from here.
which is a it's a two-sided sword there, that, because if you let them do it, you can catch them. But if you don't let them do it, they might work around it.
But at that point, you're at the we had the conversation with both the vendor and the client, and that was the agreed upon
Yeah.
solution. So
So I like that example, Don. Um,
it's a good one because it's a non-incident incident. We know what it
no,
was,
it's a real incident,
but it's a
right?
real incident. Yeah,
Yeah, and well, I think people should get used to the idea that the incident word is not necessarily bad, right?
correct.
The fact that it's an incident and that you used a plan and that you acted on it and you resolved it is what makes it not bad. But that could have
Correct.
been it could have been way worse,
Right.
right?
Well,
That
I think it's
same
the difference between incident and breach, right?
yeah, and we don't use the B word in the security world. Typically, the B word's reserved for people not running their program appropriately, right? Um,
Correct.
it's not a breach if
Not a
you
breach.
manage the incident, right?
Exactly. So we have things like that happen. Probably fairly, I don't want to say fairly regularly, but we've seen a number of them in the wild, that sort of thing that there it's an incident, but it's not necessarily a bad one, thank goodness. I think the we've had a couple other ones that Zero Trust has caught, just in the architecture that's used there. And the standard however people are bypassing MFA today, because it's, it's a crapshoot on what method they're using anymore. We've had a couple of those, and all
It
of which.
does seem like MFA was this impassable barrier for so long because so many people didn't have passwords that if
Mhm.
you had MFA, you were the hardened target, right? But now with increasing MFA adoption, we're also seeing increasing use of MFA robots, and uh, it is like a couple of clicks for an attacker to hijack SMS codes, right? They don't even have to know how it works. There's like a form on the website, and for like $5, they like stick quarters in the slot, and they stolen your SMS codes, right? They have no idea how it works. Someone's intercepting that, right? So that's real. But then there's also like for $50 you can break into someone's phone and
Oh,
steal
yeah.
steal it out of their phone, and that's of course only if the phone is vulnerable or the person using the phone's vulnerable. So that opens the whole door of like, well, how do you protect from that, right? That's a deep well, right?
It is, it is. I think one of my I'm gonna give one more example because I think it's one of my favorite ones, and this was a couple years ago, so the technology and you know, it's old, but it's an oldie but a goodie. How's that? A couple years ago when the new thing was putting rules into Outlook, right? To steal emails and,
Oh yeah,
move
the
things
auto
around.
forwarder.
The auto
Yep.
forwarders, the stuff like that. So there was a rule put into somebody's mailbox, and honestly, we didn't know if it was targeted. We didn't know what the scenario was. In this case, it wasn't a company that you would target normally unless you were looking for very specific information on, maybe clients that you were looking to target that would have been high value, that kind of thing. So I can't imagine, what anybody had gotten out of it, but they were reading the email, they were forwarding some of them, not all of them, which was, like I said, that's why I think it was a little bit more targeted, but I think that was one of my favorites
Like
too.
with keywords or something, or from certain people, or
Certain people.
yeah.
Yeah, it was certain people targeted. So that's how the rule was written. So obviously the target had to, click on it and do all kinds of stuff to have that
So wait,
happen. But
let's stop right there. A little PSA here. Um, that was, I don't know what year you're talking about, but there was a time when forwarders and mail rules were innocent, and then attackers began using them, and it became standard operating for an attacker to do that. And these days, it's best practice to disallow that for your entire organization, to
correct.
never
And this would have
allow that
been
auto forwarding.
5 years ago, probably, maybe a
Yeah,
little more.
but I think that there's probably a lot of people running out there that haven't enforced that rule yet. And whether you're in Google land or you're in Microsoft land for your email or someplace else, you should be disabling forwarding outside the org.
Yeah,
That's
and not just for this. I think some of it too is that whole, you might have, an insider that's forwarding, some type of IP
there's a list
outside,
of
right? There's a
reasons
whole
why.
list of things that you'd want to get rid of that for. But yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that was another one that was caught from the SOC. They saw some things that were just unusual and some unusual traffic, which I thought was interesting that they were able to catch that. So I'm amazed sometimes at what people are able to catch and what they're looking at and the triggers that actually set them up to look at something with, human eyes. I've been in this industry long enough that I shouldn't be,
But
amazed
they're
by
not all
anything, but
equal, right?
they're
Like
not. They're
there
not.
was a period of years where like I just rolled my eyes anytime someone said the word sock because there was a period of years where what was sold on the market was almost universally
Bad.
bad. Almost universally bad, like useless, like just like a waste of money.
Right.
Um I don't That's not the case now. It's definitely not the
No.
case now, but they're not all equal, right? Not only are there some vendors that are much better than others or more cost effective than others, but you really need to tune your SOC or your threat detection in tooling to the specific environment and the specific customer and what they're trying to protect against. And
Yep. Yep.
there's a bit of a sizing exercise there, right?
There is, and sometimes the vendor will do it for you. Sometimes you're using, secondary pieces of software to feed them information or whatever, and you're going to have to do some of that for yourself. But we've had really, really good luck. Again, knock on wood. We've had really good luck with it.
So Any other horror stories to share?
Oh gosh, no. Again, I wish that I could say that, oh, we have, a gazillion stories of all of this, but we don't. And I'm very happy to say that we don't have huge horror stories. The horror stories that we end up with are from the I told you so's. Like you tell a client to do a thing, they don't do the thing, and like 2 weeks later, the thing happens, and you're like, here we are. So we've had a couple of those, and it's things like, I know you have this little drive sitting there with stuff on it that you don't really want to pay to back up or protect or whatever because it's just stuff sitting. But the moment you do that, something's going to happen to the drive or something's going to, happen to a piece of it or whatever, and there you're going to be looking for a way to get it back. And wouldn't you know it, it was literally 2 weeks later, and client had that scenario happen. So
So, all right, let's do a quick lessons learned. We went over NIST CSF, which basically amounts to write a plan, make sure it covers incidents, make sure it covers how to back stuff up, how to restore stuff, who's involved, when to communicate with them, right? Like that's the basics of it.
that is the basics, but make it generic enough that it survives
Yeah,
the
survives
the issue.
contact,
Yep.
right? So do that in the simplest way possible. Really, is a great place to start because there's a lot of people, a lot, and this is like if this is you, don't feel bad. It's probably half of you haven't done this at all, right? So start someplace simple, right? Find excuses for incidents for the not incidents, right? To work out the muscle and make it better. Um,
I still like the nightmare scenario. That's amazing. Throw those into a pile and pick one that's not horrific and start there.
I didn't invent that. I pulled that from a book, but yeah, there apparently people have been doing this for a long time.
Who knew? Who knew?
um, yeah. So there's exercises that come from the military that are basically the ones that we are using in the security world because they use the same for planning for all sorts of contingencies, right? Um, so anyway, plan, test, right? Um, we talked about, of course, how to even figure out what you're defending against, right? How to find those mission critical assets. Before we wrap, let's talk a little bit more about Don. So you've got a couple hats,
Jeez.
right?
One or two. One or
All right.
two.
Well, what shed hat?
What do you want to know? Like I
Okay.
never
Well,
know
this,
what to
this is
say.
this is normally the plugs section of of the live stream. So
That's fair. That's so I run an MSP. We're in
okay.
South Central Pennsylvania, and we also have clients all over the United States. I think we're actually out to New Mexico at this point, so we are not on the left coast. But other than that, we cover the rest. Big verticals for us are legal, cannabis, law enforcement, which is a weird cycle there. Manufacturing, and insurance. So we have a really nice group of folks that we work with on the regular, and so a lot of it is the higher risk people that need some GRC help in the middle there. So we do a lot of that. So FTC, a
CGIS,
lot of
all that, right?
CGIS is a
Yeah.
big one for us, and HIPAA. We do doctors' offices and some legal also that touch HIPAA. So that's where we're at with that. And then on the other side of things that I also do, we have a community called the Tech Degenerates, which a bunch of you I know are completely familiar with, which is a very supportive group of technical people that basically just want to make sure that we're, raising the tide for everybody involved. So it's educational, it's support, it's, making sure that you get what you need when you need it. And it's even down to like, oh, you need some extra hands somewhere along the way. One of us will, pitch in some of our resources to give you a hand there too.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that I think anyone that's made it to mid maturity level with their MSP and didn't burn out early has done it with the help of peers.
Yeah,
Um,
100%.
yeah, I would say 100%. I would say
100%.
all of them. That's the way you make it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the only
So,
way to do it, and there are
yeah,
so many good people out there, and I mean, I know a bunch of you are here. Reagan hopped into the chat. I saw that. Henry, I'm sure, is here watching. So there are so many good people out there that if you don't know some of us, by all means, shoot me a note on LinkedIn or whatever. I'll be more than happy to get you hooked up with a bunch of us because we're really here to help other people not make the same mistakes that we did so you can get to where we are faster than we did.
All right. Well, I'm going to do my quick one. Fort Mesa is here in channel to support MSPs, TSPs, other service providers with developing their cybersecurity businesses, sales, service delivery, and evidencing. Um, we do that by using GRC software to align you and your clients with all sorts of regulatory and security standards. We've got some vulnerability management workflows. Check us out if you're interested. Um, Next week, we have humanizing MSP services in a technical realm with Jonathan Schofield from Channel Falcon. That's going to be at 2:30 Eastern Time next Friday. Um, Looking forward to it. And again, of course, like, comment, share here on LinkedIn, and check us out on YouTube. Subscribe. Thank you, Don.
Yeah, absolutely. This
And
was this is fun.
hopefully, we'll have you back again in the coming couple quarters.
Yeah, anytime. Just you know where to get me.
Great. All right, I'm gonna dial us out here if I can find the button. There it is.